Are you suffering from imposter syndrome? Maybe you are feeling demotivated. Are you seeing yourself working on boring business applications for the rest of your career and that is filling you with dread? I think that most developers go through that phase in their professional life, but the keyword here is phase. This too shall pass. Our guest today talks about his life and career, falling in and out and back in love with development, changing countries and continents, and eventually landing at Meta, where he works to this day. I hope you will enjoy what's about to follow. Let's get into it. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the episode 40 of the Office Hours podcast. Today, I'd like to welcome a new guest. His name is Gary. He's my friend and colleague from some ways back at Copperleaf. We get a chance to talk about it, and our overall goal today is to kind of chat about how people end up in IT, like how they start there, how they continue, and what kind of future they expect to have. So yeah, please welcome Gary. And Gary, if you can tell us maybe a short bit about yourself, that'd be great.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Gary. I used to work with Vasili quite a few years back actually. Um, was working with him for I think almost close to 4 years. Um, Enjoyed my time with him. I've been a developer for almost, I would say like 8 to 10 years, depending on how you count years of experience. Yeah, glad to share my learning so far and any sort of experience I have.
Nice, awesome, yeah. So we met at Copperleaf, which kind of falls roughly in like the second part of our respective careers. Like we when I joined Copperleaf, you're already working there, right? And we worked pretty much like we quit the company like in a week or two difference. Were you first or was I first? I think you were first.
I think it was I think it was kind of announced within like a 1 or 2 days of each other, but also the end date, the leaving date was exactly the same, which raised a lot of.
A lot of
I don't
concerns.
know if I imagine it would have raised a lot of suspicion. It's like
Yeah,
coordinated, but it wasn't.
yeah. It was an interesting. It was kind of this funny story that one day it was basically peak of COVID. Everybody was working remote. We were occasionally like showing up at the office, and then I don't remember exactly the details. It kind of gets a little blurry, but it was along those lines. It's like either you came up to me and you said, "Hey, I want to talk to you about something," or I came up to you and I said, "I want to talk about something." And I'm like, "Okay, you'll go first." No, you go first. Like, well, I think I'm gonna quit in like in a couple of weeks, so I'm gonna tell our manager like today or tomorrow. And then it was like, "Oh yeah, me too." I was like, "Oh damn, he's gonna be not very happy about it because like two developers leaving at the same time is kind of rough." But yeah, for me, it kind of felt like that job ran its course because we just wrapped up a couple of projects and the future wasn't like particularly certain. I remember we were doing like some research for some prototype that wasn't particularly interesting. I don't know how it was for you at the time, but that's what kind of it felt like for me.
Yeah, that brings back memories. I think uh, the conversation started because one of us wanted references. Um, and
Oh
then it's
yeah,
like,
that's right.
why are
That's
you?
right.
I forgot who, but it's like, why are you requesting references? It can only mean one thing. Um, and I largely felt the same way, having worked there for over 3 years. I felt that especially, I think one of the major reasons was COVID. So it kind of like, um, you're working from home, so you're not surrounded by that same environment, that familiar environment of, showing up every day, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. Well, technically, I wasn't showing up 9 to 5, but more
That's
like
besides the point.
10:30 or 11 to, I don't know, 5 or 6. Um, but once that sort of office environment was stripped away, and COVID saw a lot of hiring going on, and so I felt less sort of, what's a word for it? Tied to that job in some sense, less loyal. I think loyal was the word what I was looking for.
Right.
And I don't think the work we were doing was fun. It was actually sort of like a legacy code base, legacy technology in some sense.
Oh yeah, yeah. You were still developing, like maintaining some features for like the old project, and around the same time, we kind of heard on a grapevine that even if we're gonna be supporting that at all or not, and it kind of felt like, ooh, we spent many years of our lives building this thing, and now they're saying like it's not even gonna go further. That was kind of rough. And
Yeah.
yeah, like definitely the remote work kind of killed the vibes because everyone left the office. I was like still showing up, and a couple of other people were showing up, but like out of an office of like 200 plus people, it was basically like 4 or 5 people, and we kind of like just waved to one another across the hall. So, and I mean, work accomplished was pretty cool. It was like a good group of people. Plus, all the ping pong was also nice. Having the ping pong Slack, and everyone just posts a picture of a paddle, and then everybody sort of takes up and goes plays ping pong, and then COVID like just killed the whole thing. The lunches, the walks, yeah. I think that everyone's like definitely way more depressed around those times. So a desire to shake up your life in any meaningful way is totally understandable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. It's just I just felt like I had, some sort of freedom now since I'm at home every day. It's like I'm a free mercenary. It's like, okay, I'm gonna go look for some other kind of job, see what's out there. Um, in fact, when I first joined, we were on the same project, and so uh, I wasn't a very particularly experienced developer, and I was kind of tied. I was kind of married to the technologies I liked, such as like Node.js and TypeScript, JavaScript, and all that. Um, and then I think after 2 or 3 years, we got switched to another project. We were using .NET
.NET.
Core.
Yeah.
So that was kind of fine. It was more modern, but then we kept regressing. It's like now we're working on like the flagship piece of software, which is God knows how old it is, probably like 10, 15 years by now. And I remember like I think there were two things. I remember trying to change a line of code, which was 5 or 6 years ago, but the guy who originally changed it either left or was on some sort of yearly 2 month leave. Um, and then it was like some sort of magic number. It was like some sort of hacky code, and then I just felt like, okay, I don't think I'm learning anything here. And the second thing is I one day like looked back at all the past projects and all that because I was kind of cleaning up my resume, right?
Hmm.
And then I just realized how little passion I had left, how much passion was drained out of me. It was very typical. The stuff we're working on was very typical, like enterprisey, um, kind of like CRUD sort of software business application, and I just forgot like how much I somewhat enjoyed, or really enjoyed once upon a time, like hacking on something new or working on some sort of passion project, which we can kind of get into later. And now it was like I think it was like early or mid stage burnout,
Yeah, probably,
essentially.
probably.
Yeah.
In last 2 or 3 episodes, we keep bringing up the topic of burnout. Because I had my friend Ali on, and we talked about my burnout episode, and he said that if you start dreading doing the
You're
things,
probably already within it. I
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
listened to
yeah,
that one too. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, it definitely feels like it when you're just doing this menial work and not really learning anything, and you're digging through like really old crappy code, and even if you wanted to change it, you realize the absolute futility of that entire endeavor. It's like it's not going to help anyone, and especially yourself. It's just going to be frustrating and stressful. It's like, yeah, of course, like I feel like quitting at the time or switching it was appropriate. And especially as you said, if you're at home all day just working for a software company, it doesn't really matter which software company you're working for if you're like don't have that connection with it anymore. So yeah, like that's totally valid.
Yeah.
um yeah.
In fact, we could have went the overemployed route, which is to get 2 or 3 remote jobs at the same time. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
not advice here. I also felt like at least my experience working there was the nice thing was that because there weren't much urgent deadlines per se. It wasn't like a high stress, fast moving environment. So we kind of had a lot of free time to bicker or kind of debate about technicalities of programming languages. I remember you were playing with TypeScript for quite a while. You were also playing with like functional programming and stuff like that. So that's a nice thing, but I felt like the sort of technical skills I would say required for bringing whatever feature was requested to be built is not very high. As the more you work there, it's like you can only become more proficient with the underlying business logic, which is kind of independent of code. Like you're learning all this specific jargon, specific terminology, and all these business processes, which just so happens to be code, but you're not really like learning about like
Right.
cutting edge stuff anymore.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair. It's kind of funny because Copperleaf is when I actually started doing TypeScript. I didn't really do any TypeScript before that, but because the whole project was in the new TypeScript-based Angular, you kind of had to. And it's my favorite tool now. So I did learn something out of it. So that was I can't necessarily complain about that. But yeah, no, that's very fair. And the bit about like just instead of learning new ways to code, you just learn the local flavor and local specifics and like the jargon and lingo and everything. It's like why the first 3 to 6 months at any new job is stressful is because you can't leverage any of that knowledge from your previous job. You just need to forget it all and relearn all the new things that they do there that you are not aware. So in the first meetings, it's like, remember that feeling when it's like your first week and you're joining meetings and people are talking about things and like, I know some of those words, but I don't know what they mean.
Yeah, still happens quite a bit. Well, not happens quite a bit. Happens every time the first 3 to 6 months, like you said,
Yeah,
in a new team, which we can also get into later. Because
yeah, yeah.
um,
So I guess, I was stalking your LinkedIn profile just to sort of see what you've been up to in all these years. Like, you started your IT thing originally, you were in US, right? Or you were at least working for an American company.
yeah, I mean, I can go all the way back. Since if you scroll to the very bottom of LinkedIn, you usually see like education.
Right.
So I guess I can start from there.
Oh,
We don't
yeah.
need to get into like elementary school, whatever. But um, we I basically studied engineering in university. I studied electrical engineering specifically, but the reason why I ended up in there is just all happenstance. That wasn't like my childhood, dream or anything. It was just it just so happens that that was a considered like a harder major, but it also had a lower GPA cutoff. And my first choice was like mechanical. But honestly, in hindsight, I'm glad I just went into electrical, which is kind of close to computer engineering, but you don't take as much CS courses. So I was basically kind of like I dreaded programming in the very beginning when I took those kind of standard curriculum courses in university where they just throw you like a textbook about C and then have you write functions by hand in your final exam. So I that did not spark my interest at all. And then eventually, there was like around second or third year, kind of like people are looking for internships, and I realized that there were a lot more programming software related jobs than there were like traditional engineering jobs. And I figured, okay, if I just need to, it just felt more preppable to get into one of these jobs. There was a more streamlined sort of, interview prep sort of advice. So the first thing I did was try to add like side projects to my resume. That's when I kind of played with Python a little bit. And I found that a lot better because it's like a dynamic language. You don't have to like write all this other like boilerplate crap just to get your
Just to print hello world to
application working.
screen. Yeah.
Yeah, you just literally. I remember telling my friend it's like you literally just type print hello world and it'll actually print something. So eventually I think I failed at a bunch of interviews, and then I had a friend that just so happened to work at this American company down in the States. Can I just say what the company is?
Yeah, I think it probably is
Okay,
fine. Yeah.
so they're called Gatekeeper Systems. They make shopping cart wheels that lock. They're actually used at most of the big retailers. So next time you go to Costco, in Canada. I think Superstore uses it, Walmart.
So like if you take
Um,
it past a certain point, it stops moving basically.
there's I don't know if there's IP or anything. There's like some wire underground, um, at like either like the doors, the entrance, or even
The
the shop.
parking lot.
Sorry, not
Yeah.
shopping cart, the parking lot. And then one of them will lock, and one of them locking is enough to stop the
Hmm.
shopping wheel, to stop the wheels. But
Yeah.
anyways, the I didn't actually learn much there either because um, the position was called embedded firmware something test engineer, but the product is like out there. Like I was working with a few engineers and they weren't actively really like refactoring the whole code base, writing new features because all this firmware kind of got loaded onto this
Yeah.
chip.
It's like our feature
Um,
is lock the wheels and unlock the wheels. There's not much flexibility in what you can do there.
and they just had they actually they would go to China every year just to inspect the factory, making sure that the wheels are properly produced. But it's not going. It's definitely the farthest thing away from something like web development. So I didn't learn much there, but I had a passion project. If I can talk about that really briefly. At some point, I wanted to make a game. I don't know how I got that idea, but I wanted to kind of make some sort of side scroller like fighting game, kind of similar to Scott Pilgrim or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, something like that. And I kind of fell in love actually. So for the first time in my life, I actually wanted to, go to a coffee shop after work and continue coding, which is kind of crazy now that I think about it.
Yeah, no, I totally
Like,
know how that feels like. There's nothing
yeah,
crazy about it to me. I was just saying in the previous episode that, like, sadly, I don't do that anymore, but there was a time where that was just predominant occupier of my time is just like geeking out and playing around with computers.
yeah, and that's a very for me that was the opposite of burnout, I would say. So I was working on that every night. I was using something called Corona SDK, like coronavirus. Shouldn't make that, but using a language called Lua, which is also just very like light and kind of scripty, kind of like Python. I worked on that for like every single day, multiple hours for like a year. Eventually, and, very games are very hard to kind of succeed with, because there's this whole element of like, is your game actually fun? Just because you added in all this stuff and you think it's fun, but no one else finds it's fun. Um, so yeah, that actually, long story short, that actually got me an interview at my second internship, which was actually a mobile game company based in China, of all places. So I if you're a listener and you're like trying to get your foot in the door in the career, my sort of playbook back then was to find a company I'm actually interested in, try to make like this mock demo, this mini prototype of something, related. If it's very easy if it's a game company, just make your own mini game, kind of showing your passion. Basically, I was trying to signal my passion by hacking away something quick and then kind of trying to impress someone with it and then sending like a customized email to HR, or even like an engineer there and trying to get my foot in the door. So I'll pause there if you have any comments or questions.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of a good plan. And in terms of virality, I think you're either building commercial games or you're building passion projects, and some of those passion projects occasionally happen to explode, you know. I guess now we're way past that, but maybe around like 2004, 2005, the indie gaming scene was just kind of starting up. There's like the indie game, the movie documentary about like Minecraft and like all these early games. And the people there do their interviews, and one of them, the guy that I follow quite a lot, John Blow, he said like, I'm just building games for me. And then if other people happen to enjoy them, that's kind of like an added benefit. So there's like two different schools of thought about how to look at it. It's like, oh yeah, I just want to build the next Flappy Bird and become a millionaire, or I'm just building a game because I can't not build a game. So yeah, it's just kind of wanted I wanted to add to that.
Yeah, exactly. Especially after Flappy Bird came out and the developer was actually someone from Vietnam, but he was like making like 40,000 a day or something, and then he was getting death threats. But yeah, game dev is not it's very different, but it's also like it captures your imagination a lot more than business applications, that's for sure. I remember every day I was having these wild thoughts or ideas and dreams about how I wanted to take the game, but I think yeah, it's not for everyone, but and I don't know how much it improved my programming chops because I there was no code review. I was just like randomly hacking away in one file, and I think one file had 8,000 lines or something like that. I had no idea like how to structure my code, stuff like that. But at the same time, it's like you're not bounded by these code reviews or
Yeah.
these design patterns necessarily, especially if you're a noob.
Yeah. The
So it
criteria
was fun.
is like, is your game fun and doesn't work fast enough so it runs on budget devices? If both of those things are true, then who cares, literally.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the fun things I was trying to do as well was making it multiplayer, and so I was like looking into. It was the first time I ever like got a what is it called, like a Linux. Nowadays they call it droplets or AWS, kind of
Like a
like your
virtual
own
machine,
private, yeah, private virtual
private
machine,
VM, yeah,
private
yeah. VPS.
VPS, I think it was called. And then I set up like a multiplayer server. It was just like kind of relaying, WebSocket like user commands, like using WebSockets. It was eye opening. Like the first time I could get multiplayer working, it was like, oh, this looks like magic. It's that quote like in advanced sufficiently
Yeah,
advanced technology is indistinguishable
indistinguishable
from
from
magic.
magic. Yeah, exactly.
So I kind of had those kind of moments and stuff like that. But that's long in the past. Eventually got kind of forced into web development like most people. Yeah.
See what web development does to people who turn jaded and cynical.
Yeah.
So like you joined a gaming company and it was like a mobile gaming company. I actually found a couple of videos of the game online. Like, I don't think I can find the game itself online, but I did found some of the videos. It was like this sort of cowboy shooter type thing.
Yeah. Yeah, the game was a hit once upon a time. I think they're making a lot of money. Although, like compared to the leader back then, which is a Supercell, Clash of Titans, it was nothing. But it was enough to keep like a whole company of people, feed a whole company of people. And I think the company folded a few years after. Um, and I would say like I wasn't. I was continuing to work on my side game. The sort of main if I had to look back on this arc of my journey, it wasn't so much like what I learned on the job. It was just more like experience of living in China for the first time. Um, the technologies used were I wasn't I would say I wasn't like a super curious like eager kind of learner in some sense. Like I mean we were using what's Unity, right? Unity and some sort of complicated backend for Python. But I wasn't the type to like read every line of code because I was so curious how every single thing worked. And I think I was kind of just recycling. Like I was like repeatedly doing something similar. I was like adding sound effects to one of those games, um, and that honestly was just all right. But in terms of development, it was just all right. I would say,
Hmm.
yeah.
So effectively, like you worked on a couple of mobile games, but it was not something again like super creative, just more functional changes that weren't like that particularly advanced.
Oh, yeah, that now I recall. I think like a few weeks into working there, I got put onto this new project. Originally, I was going to work on their main flagship game, which is called High Noon 2, which had a decent amount of success. Like if you search the internet, there's still traces of it or videos like you saw. They decided to reskin the game into something called Days of Crime, which is based on the original High Noon, which you might guess is based on Wild West. The Wild West is like you got like all these
It was like
cowboys and
duels.
lassos and yeah and guns. Um, now they switched to like some sort of Chicago, New York sort of mafia gangster sort of uh, backdrop or like backstory. So they basically just
They
try
just
to like
reskinned.
and try to make a new game
Yeah,
basically, but it's exactly the same thing. So like kind of
yeah. That's a
so it
very
wasn't.
very popular playbook in game dev. It's like, look at Ubisoft. Just take a game, reskin all the assets, and release it without even sometimes changing the map. Hey, it works for them.
Yeah, so it wasn't super inspiring, and I don't, to be honest, I don't recall learning too much from it. Like I don't, there weren't, although it was, so basically most of the employees were Chinese, but it was originally founded by I think they're European people. A lot of the upper leadership was, you know, European, but I don't think we had like proper, I don't think we had super like standard kind of American or software engineering practices. Like we didn't have code reviews or anything, and I think I think the work I got was also relatively easy. So I don't think I learned a whole lot from that. Uh, but I was still working on my game at night, that kind of thing. So I would say overall it was a pretty decent experience.
Yeah. So why did you decide to move on from there?
At some point, I don't know, I don't recall when, and it wasn't a moment. It wasn't a particular moment. So I was there for 4 months, and then I think uh, sometime after, I think around this time, I was also like, this was my last internship. I was about to graduate last semester. I graduated. Um, I had like a fallout with my my partner for the for the game, so that kind of he was the artist, so that kind of like I couldn't draw. I couldn't draw these like animations or sprites or anything or background art. And then the project the project stopped. And I also at the same time kind of found myself like disliking playing games because I kind of had this different mindset now. I'm like trying to figure out why they made the game addictive, and and so I it's almost like I got like a shot, like a vaccine. Like I can't be addicted to games anymore because I know exactly what they're trying to do
You know
on
how
the
the
other
sausage
side.
is made?
Yeah, yeah, and so I and I knew, you know, like the game development industry isn't particularly kind, and I don't recall myself having these crazy aspirations to work at, I don't know, Blizzard or EA or Riot or something. I think at some point I did, or Valve, but um, I think I just eventually sort of moved on. I don't recall the details. So I was looking for basically web development jobs.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So it mentions that after you've departed from the gaming world, you kind of did the digital nomad for a while. How did that work out for you?
Yeah. Interesting. So in between, so I basically after graduation, I went back. I'll just go over this briefly. I went back to Hong Kong. I worked for this edutech startup. Um, you know, eventually kind of got fed up with various aspects of it. And around the same time, I met some people by going to um meetups and stuff like that. And basically, we had this. I don't know if it's a weird agreement, but I was paid like a monthly allowance, a very low monthly allowance stipend to just work on this full time. Well, although I wasn't an employee, so I was. We had this like little company set up, this company structure. It was based around like scraping. This is not edutech anymore, so this is a new project after that the edutech startup. Basically scraping stock market data, stuff like that. But I was mainly like happy to um, not have to go to the office anymore and not have to really uh, answer to a boss exactly. Like my partner was more like a peer in some sense. But the digital nomad thing is a weird. I know I put that there because it sounds more, you know, kind of
It sounds fancier than it actually is.
sexier, but I think I got the idea to do that because I was listening to a lot of like Tim Ferriss back then, and he had this guest on once, which had this. I think there's a book called Vagabonding, And also he himself as a kind of like a kind of, I don't know if you call him a cult leader or like the key influencer of that sort of, oh, you can actually, you have a laptop, you can do geo arbitrage, you can work in Bali, Indonesia while making US dollars, live like a king, drop shipping, that kind of thing. So I was fairly impressionable at that point, and I just thought, why not? But I actually didn't end up going on as many trips as I wanted because I basically couldn't really save on a very low measly stipend. So I traveled solo like once or twice. I also went on this like random backpacking trip with a friend for over like a month, and I would just work like 2 3 hours out of a coffee shop every day. So that was okay, but like I don't think I was like into as dialed in or plugged in into like the work as I should have. I was doing a lot of like silly coding work, but I wasn't actually like thinking about the business. I just kind of left it to my partners.
It was
It's
more of a
also yeah.
downshifty kind of vibes, right?
Yeah, I think I was just sort of in this drifting phase in my life. Like on one hand, I was kind of like I also, aside from being like like into this idea of being a digital nomad, I was also kind of reading too much uh, either Reddit or Quora back then, and I was kind of like, why would I want to work for a corporate company? And I just thought of that as sort of like evil and sort of like a like a like corporate slavery, kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
like a
The never
I
ending
didn't
soul destroying hamster wheel, the
yeah
cubicle life.
I was just thinking if only because my that web that stock scraping web app thing I was trying to we were trying to basically sell like a subscription service, and I calculated like as long as there was something like a thousand customers, then it's essentially I had enough passive income to do whatever I wanted, and that like really took me ideologically away from as far as I could from the corporate world. It's like why would I want a 9 to 5 ever again if I could just make this happen? Um, but eventually I kind of ran out of steam. Didn't couldn't get like more than one paying customer. Kind of funny. Um, so eventually went back to Canada, and that's how I eventually uh,
Hmm.
got into Copperleaf.
So did you like you returned to to the country, to Canada back, and like just started looking for jobs right away?
I had a few months of denial. Um, I was I was still getting paid that monthly stipend thing, allowance, but I was my daily routine for the longest time during that so-called digital nomad. I don't know if there's there, there should be. I know there's a term like entrepreneur instead of entrepreneur, but I think there should be another kind of. I wasn't really digital nomad. I was just like a serial coffee like coffee shop. Like I
Coffee.
would overstay my stay at a coffee shop. I would stay there for like 8 hours
Oh,
and
geez.
sip on the same like Americano until I felt kind of guilty, and then I would get like the cheapest kind of biscuit or something or pastry.
8 hours is a
Um,
lot. That's like stretching it. So, you know.
yeah, I look back and I had no idea how I did that, but I was just like in a very uncomfortable environment. It's loud. There's all these people talking, but at the same time, it's kind of like at least better than being at home in the basement or something. I think a co-working space would be even better than a coffee shop, but a coffee shop kind of like at least kind of like put me out there. Um, listen to sometimes enjoyed eavesdropping and stuff like that, but I was I was slowly sort of feeling like I hit a dead end, and the amount of money I was kind of getting paid, it was amounting to something like $1,000 a month. So it wasn't it, it was just not enough to progress in my life in any meaningful way. And I don't think I was as that like I didn't I started to lose faith in myself. It's like I'm not really a kind of like a go-getter. It's like I feel like some people who are truly meant to be entrepreneurs, they're always looking for ideas. They can see hope even before they can. I feel like they can see hope a lot clearer. I was kind of like
Yeah.
more staring at an abyss.
Yeah. Some people
Um,
have like the level of optimism that bounders on like delusion.
Yeah, exactly. Because I would like, I recall like oftentimes that it's like I feel like I'm nothing right now. Like I'm not. I feel like I fell off the tracks of like the social kind of role
Social
I'm supposed to
hierarchy.
play.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was like really getting to me. It's like I'm unemployed kind of, and then I was just going to the coffee shop or the library every day. My friends wouldn't be available until after like 7 or 8 p.m. Um, and I just didn't have enough. I just didn't like. I wasn't resourceful enough to kind of make something out of that, I would say. Um, so eventually went back to looking for employment.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's one of those situations that I heard about. It's like if things were worse, they would probably be better. But because you have that stipend, you have like some money coming in, you live, I guess, you have a place to live, so you don't have to struggle for that much. Like if things were definitely worse, like you have $0 in your bank account, you're gonna get kicked out to the street at the end of the month, that would really that really puts a fire underneath you. But if you're allowed to be in this kind of coasting type of state, you can stay in that state for a really long time. And getting knocked out of that, that takes some doing on anyone's part. So
Exactly. I found it more or less difficult to maintain um kind of like my mental state or my psyche in some sense. It's like I didn't have that daily routine aside from going to the coffee shop, but I was mostly just alone. I wasn't really talking to people. Um and I was also living with my parents and on I just didn't see myself progressing sort of to this typical, what my peers what my peer group was typically doing. Like there some of them already kind of like buying places, um, you know,
did you get
you
hell from your strict Asian family?
they were actually somewhat lenient about that, but I think they were increasingly worried because I wasn't that young anymore. And I remember like telling my friends like I just don't want to work right now.
Hmm.
And they didn't have like they couldn't muster a response for me because it's like you've totally fell off the rails from an Asian typical like there's not many Asian like wandering artists or like broke musicians or that kind of archetype stereotype.
Right.
It's just not a conventional path. It's like all of them are
So,
either
yeah.
software developers or they're accountants and um
So
it's like
like
what are you doing?
there's no connection. They can't relate to you, and you can't relate to them, right? So like it's kind of hard because you can't even get support from your group of friends because they have no idea what you're going through. And at the same time, you only appreciate what they're going through because like you're in a different situation. So it's like a huge chunk of your support network just drops off. Even though like you maintain contact, it's just like, oh, suddenly we have nothing to talk about.
Yeah, it's hard to really offer advice or like good luck. I don't know, like you should get a job, but they wouldn't say that. So um
Like get a haircut and get a job, you goddamn hippie.
yeah. Um
So
yeah,
yeah, so you
and then not
start,
long after,
yeah.
yeah, let's start looking for a job. I actually found a Copperleaf posting on because I was reading Hacker News a lot. Um but I wasn't like perusing through every thread. I was kind of looking at the who's hiring. Uh I think it's like a weekly kind of thread or daily, something like that. And um, I was looking. The remote was not really a popular thing back then, so I was found the Copperleaf posting in Vancouver, sent an email. Um, well, luckily, very luckily, like I was using like um the Node.js Express like PostgreSQL tech stack for this startup P project. So I was kind of relevant, kind of could get through the screening in some sense. And you know, luckily I was still somewhat relevant of a developer, although not a very like. I remember getting quizzed on very specific like details about Node.js. Like what is the maximum memory limit of like one running process, and I couldn't answer at all. Um,
Hell, I probably can't even answer that right now.
I think it was
It's like,
1.7 gigabytes, but
yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
So I took I was also talking to recruiters at that point in time as well, I think. But yeah, so So yeah, welcomed employment again. Started working there. But I wasn't feeling that much better once I started working. Like when I got my first paycheck again, it's like okay, I'm back on track in some sense. But the commute was far. I felt like the company wasn't very young. To be honest, I just felt like it's kind of like slow moving, but at least it's safe.
Our team was pretty
Um,
young, I would say.
our team was young, but the rest of the company was like kind of on the you know,
Yeah.
not to be ageist, but the reason is because at the edutech startup, I was working with guys younger than me.
Hmm.
The like 22, 20, 23 year olds, like college dropouts. So it's very, very different. Um, yeah, so I wasn't super happy in the beginning either at Copperleaf because like I just remember one day thinking like in the morning, it's like who gets excited. I had this existential question like who's excited like thinking about working on this kind of software? And the best answer I could give myself at that time was like, well, at least it pays the bills, but that wasn't enough of an answer for me. And eventually I got used to it. I don't know how, but it's like once you're sort of like contributing and in these discussions and you sort of have this minimum level of knowledge or proficiency about something, you tend to sort of have a sense of attachment to
Right.
it. But in the beginning, I was like, who gets excited about enterprise business software? It's like who to stretch it a little bit, like I don't think there's any 8, 10-year-olds kids right now being like, when I grow up, I want to work on, you
Boring
know,
business applications.
enterprise software, right?
That is true, but I guess
Like filling out
yeah,
NetSuite every day.
yeah. Oh my God, filling out NetSuite, Jesus Christ, that was. I hated it with passion. It was so shit. But I guess the question, like maybe if you can make the answer to that question, it's like me. I'm excited to work on enterprise applications, like because a lot of it, it feels like it's almost like a state of mind or like a framing thing, because you could still find cool things to do. Like, I mean, I've been working on predominantly boring business applications for my entire career, and I don't know. I guess it's different for everyone in terms of what excites them. But as long as you get to play with some amounts of cool shit in the process, you can kind of justify the rest. And as you said, it does pay your bills. But like, how was the switch up between like you went from China to Canada and you went from a series of sort of this loosey goosey, no quality control, we just sort of throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks, to like a Canadian company that is quite enterprisey with all the processes and bureaucracies and rituals and all of that. Like how was that for you? Was that a welcome change after all of that, or was it more like, oh my god, I have to deal with all this crap now?
It was actually, I would say it's actually a welcome change in some sense because um, I I realized when I first started working at Copperleaf and I had one-on-ones and code reviews and whatnot, um, that actually my programming was horrible. Like I didn't name things properly. I just chucked whatever code into a function and called it a day. I think most of what my manager back then was trying to kind of grill or drill into me is solid principles, like clean code, solid principles. But um, I kind of like went too loosey goosey and kind of went too far with the I know how to write a hello world and if else and a for loop. So now I'm going to create a whole piece of software um, without ever having worked in a very structured environment where okay, you should do this, you shouldn't do that. And I also wasn't like um, the kind to kind of pick up programming books and sort of read them. I just enjoyed. I wouldn't. I don't even want to say hacking away. Just creating something. So I didn't really. Um, yeah, I wasn't doing things the right way, and that took some time of getting used to. The one-on-ones were welcome because I could find out where I was. I could get feedback, whereas before there was no such thing. I didn't even know how I was performing. To be honest, I wouldn't really ask. Right, it's kind of hard to be like, hey, how am I doing?
As long as I'm not
Right.
fired, it's all good, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I welcome those things, and I think I learned a lot
Yeah. I guess it also gives
during
you
that
like
period of
a
time.
lot of structure too, so it's easier to know how everything fits together. How long were you there before I joined? Do you remember?
I think it was less than half a year.
Less than half a year. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because yeah, I joined. I was sort of, I guess, to continue off of to riff off of episode I did with Ali when I talked about like us building a startup and me crashing and burning and not literally doing anything for an entire year. Copperleaf was like the next thing after that, and because I was still going to meetups, I was still teaching at Lighthouse, and I was still going to meetups. And Steven, our manager, hunted me. There was actually a couple of companies that I was interviewing with, and one of them was, I think it was some sort of health oriented startup. I don't remember exactly. They
I
were
remember
somewhere
this.
in North Van,
Yeah.
and Steven was just way more persistent because I was kind of hoping to get the offer from those guys, and they were dragging their feet. And Steven was like every couple of days, he'd be like, "Hey, so what do you think? Like, are you ready? Are you ready?" And then eventually I said, like, you know what? These guys are kind of not really responding to me. So I said yes to that offer. And then when those other guys said, "Hey, how come you didn't tell us?" They were like, "Well, you guys took so long, and this guy has been on my case like every other day. So he clearly wanted me more than you did. So I guess that's what it is now." So, and it was kind of funny because I wasn't fully 100% sure that I was ready to kind of commit to full time work because I was still just coming out of that burnout thing. But I decided to entertain the idea of interviewing. Uh, and I remember when I was doing it, were you there for my interview at Copperleaf? Do you remember?
Oh, I think I was.
Because I remember I just came in and I was just trolling to a lot of degrees. Like I had such a don't give a shit about the outcome attitude. Like I was not nervous at all. That was like my least nervous interview because I just did not care if I get it or not. I was still sort of not working and happy to kind of continue not doing that for a while. I mean, my financial situation was ass, but it wasn't, again, it was one of those things where it's like it wasn't pressing enough to kind of like actively start doing more stuff. And so when they extended an offer, I was like, oh, this is pretty nice. I guess this is where my life is going now, right? So then I joined that project, and like it took me good like 3 or 4 months to just uh, orient myself in the code base because the original developer who built the whole system burnt out and left like 6 months prior or something like that. And
Yeah.
so the code was quite interesting, shall we say.
Yeah. How did what did you find that was difficult like when you first started? Because people I think out there have this impression that, more senior developers don't
Mm.
get stuck as much or
Yeah,
oh wait.
I think that impression is probably not entirely accurate because so the gentleman that wrote the original architecture had a particular hammer in his hands, and therefore everything was looking like nails to him. So all code, whether it makes sense or not, was following that same pattern.
Oh yeah, no JS
It was
streams.
like no,
Literally there was code that could have been a synchronous
yeah,
plain old for loop and it was a no JS string.
it was like, yeah, like
But
something that takes 5 lines of a for loop would end up being like 3 files worth of streams for no good reason. And like it wasn't doing anything fancy, but everything had to be a stream, so everything was a stream. And it was all in JavaScript too on the back end, so there was like no TypeScript was only on front end. And I have a theory about that. Like we used Telerik controls in our
Kendo,
application.
yeah.
Was it Kendo?
Yeah, Telerik's the company, I
Telerik's the
think,
company,
behind it.
but they basically make the controls for various programming languages and IDEs. And I have a suspicion that we just had an enterprise license for their entire suite because some other products in the company they were built using like .NET and Silverlight. And I imagine that the Kendo they had controls for Silverlight, and they also happen to have controls for Angular. So they said, "Hey, we already have a license for it. Let's just use Angular." And it wasn't like some very deliberate choice. I think that how it went. It's like, well, we're already paying for this, might as well leverage it, so build it in Angular. And that's why front end was full of TypeScript, because it was essentially, you couldn't not use it. But back end was all JavaScript, and it was all streams, and it was just driving me nuts. But thankfully, after working on it for a little bit, I kind of shifted more toward front end, because I guess people also didn't really know what was happening there, because it was
Mm-hmm.
all NGRX and streams and reactive programming and TypeScript and like all of the Angular's quirks. And it was like, it took us a while to understand the right way of doing things and like slowly refactor bits and pieces of it.
Interesting. Yeah. 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 My impression is that yeah, you definitely did not like the back end very much. Um, I mean, both the in some sense both the back end and the front end is shaped out to what it became because the 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 kind of like that business process that whole thing I was trying to run is quite a bit complicated. Um, Basically trying to estimate the cost for some infrastructure project that had all these like entities and
Yeah.
all these things that you had to like kind of take a few months to really slowly soak up. And it's like what we mentioned earlier, you're sitting in meetings and you're hearing all this jargon for the first time and you don't understand.
Yeah.
In hindsight, I think my one of my big lessons from onboarding there was to kind of ask the main question, like when you're working on something for the first time, like what is the data flow and essentially what is the input and then what is the output? And don't like I actually don't really agree with like reading the whole code base because it's like maybe maybe like 20% of the code base is called like 80% of the time. Like you really need to understand
The core.
what is this program trying to do? Why was it written in the first place? And what is the primary like main flow? You don't need to care about all the other knobs and switches in the beginning for the time being. Um, I then also remember learning a lot from watching you read code because I don't know if you ever impressed this upon me like deliberately, but I got the impression from you that you assumed whoever wrote the code wrote it in good faith. And so you didn't feel the need, or maybe you just had the speed, but you would read functions, the names of the functions, you wouldn't read every single line within the function, especially if it's not relevant to what you're trying to look for at that time being. And so like suddenly it's just I think you're also doing the same thing to documentation. Um, when you're reading documentation. So I just kind of learned to let go and not really care about the code, but really think about at a higher level what I was trying to really accomplish. Like the code can, if it's well written, it should be self-explanatory, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
So
exactly. It's not, the problem is that it's how we like the world to be, but it's not how the world is. And so sometimes, you read it in a manner that you describe, to then realize that some function is doing something else that is actually actively changing the entire conversation. So right now, when I do work with like onboardings of juniors, it's like, name your functions appropriately and try not to try to ensure that whatever you call it is whatever the function does, and it doesn't do anything else or any kind of shenanigans. So
it
that
takes
yeah, it takes a
it
lot
takes a
of
while to get drill that mindset in. And along similar lines of what I just said is that I think it was at that point part of my imposter syndrome went away because back then when I was like really noob, I would read code I didn't understand and kind of there would be this voice in my head that would start feeling like, okay, I'm not competent enough. That's why I don't understand this code. But I think I recall you reading someone else's code and your immediate instinct or reaction was like, "Wow, what the heck is this?" And then that kind of spoke to me because that kind of impressed upon me the idea that like this code, whoever wrote this code was supposed to write it in a clean and clear way, but the fact that you didn't understand it within 5 seconds meant it's probably not very good code. And so there was this inflection or this kind of like inflection point for me, which is like, okay, maybe I'm reaching the level of experience now where if someone writes some unintelligible code, maybe they didn't do a good job. Maybe it's not my problem. Unless it's very esoteric, kind of like using some framework or technology you've never heard
right,
of.
right. No, I think that's a very fair summarization of that sort of switch. And yeah, I think our listeners would do well to dwell on that a little bit in their own spare time. So yeah, it was we did a lot of kind of impromptu coding and sessions, and I would occasionally just like roam around the office to just look for puzzlement on people's faces, because I kind of learned to do that with my teaching thing at Lighthouse. And I would just like, oh, he looks stuck. Let's go and see what's up. So I was doing that a lot, and we kind of had this fairly chill existence. We didn't really have too many crazy deadlines or stresses or pressures, and everyone could just play ping pong for an hour, and that nobody really gave you any second looks if you did that. And then the COVID happened, and it all kind of went to shit because everyone basically went home. We stopped doing communal activities, lunches, playing ping pong, all that kind of stuff. All that kind of fell apart, and it was quite a difficult period. And at the same time, the project that we're working on, like, we wound down the
Like a
project that we were both building.
maintenance mode.
Yeah, when I joined, we built this other project in 6 months, which we built like this prototype. Remember?
Oh, the Monte Carlo thing.
Yeah, the Monte Carlo simulator with like WebSockets and Signaler and like all this real time stuff, which I thought was pretty cool. It was like really well done in a really short period of time, and then we send it off saying, "Hey, here's our prototype. If you want, we can keep working on it." And meanwhile, they were deliberating on that. Our team kind of got ripped apart, and people were just being used to plug various holes in other projects that we
Yeah,
weren't
that's a good way to put it.
really
Yeah.
familiar with and particularly interested in. So we both moved on. And you went for some startup at the time that was
Yeah,
like
thank
this
God, because
travel looker finder thingy. Excuse me.
I was definitely slacking off pretty hard. Um, near the end of Corpo. I was as we mentioned earlier, I was the work just got increasingly um uninspiring and boring. Um, yeah, but basically I got reached out by a recruiter. It was a Toronto startup, a startup based in Toronto, remote work. Decided to interview, passed it, and then yeah, and then I switched jobs. Yeah, I can talk more about that, of course, but
Yeah. Well, I guess that one didn't last too long for you, right? You worked on this. The company, from what I remember, what you told me, the company kind of pivoted halfway through into doing something else, and then eventually you left and you joined Meta, which is pretty fancy. You moved to New York all the way. You can kind of see the backdrop in your window there. It looks pretty nice.
yeah. So working, I actually quite enjoyed working at this startup because it was a more mature startup, like compared to the edutech startup, which I didn't get into, but that was really disorganized, and I think if I had to put it, I think it was just like a finance side project for the founders. But they had noble aspirations. Um, this startup I joined, it was called Snap Travel at that time, or Snap Commerce. Now they've been rebranded to the name Super.com. Um, so they originally would sell like discounted hotel rates, mostly hotels. Yeah, mostly hotels. So if you search for some hotel, they would compete with like, kayak.com or TripAdvisor,
TripAdvisor,
Trivago,
yeah,
all
yeah.
these other booking whatever hotels.com. They actually would offer pretty competitive prices. I'm not going to get into how they kind of came up with the idea, because that's not. By the time I joined, that part of the business was quite mature. Um, my experience working there was very different from the kind I wanted. Right, I remember actually getting excited the first few weeks. It was the opposite of like Copperleaf. And Copperleaf was like, this seems really boring, until I began to kind of become closer with the personalities in the team. Start to play ping pong and have this sort of routine setting in which I didn't need to have like existential doubts anymore. Um, at the startup, it was like, okay, you're in this team now. Uh, Open your MacBook. Let's go. Oh well. the word MacBook should say something as well, because at Copperleaf we had to use Windows, and for a long time we had to use God, God forbid I ever have to use that thing again. That Ubuntu in virtual. What is it called? I had to.
Oh, like
It's a
in a virtual
traumatic
box.
memory. Yeah, that thing would randomly crash and just exit. So I felt like I was the company. I felt like at times the company was trying as hard as possible to not let me develop. Like, like, like it got that bad, and I think I think I wasted most of my at least 30% of my time or productivity there. But anyway, at this new startup, more mature, so they had like
Just to bring back, I remember
yeah.
it now started flooding in because I mean, I'm pretty used to working in systems like that. The only difference is that I usually never run the GUI. I ran my virtual box completely hidden. I would just SSH into it and like use my normal tools that I use pretty much at every job. But a lot of people weren't as comfortable with command line, so they would actually run the VM in a window with like the Linux GUI on top of like the Windows GUI. And I remember we were trying to figure out all these ways of like before VS Code web became a thing, there was like how would I get my code so I can work on it on a Windows side as opposed to on a slow like UI of the virtual machine.
Yeah.
And there was like all these different things that we tried to do. So I think I didn't have that problem because again, like SSH is SSH and like Vim is Vim, but a lot of people were not particularly happy with that setup. I don't even remember why, because I guess it was deployed on Linux at the clients, so we kind of had to develop it on Linux to ensure that it's compatible or whatever. I don't remember exactly.
Like no, that project didn't properly run on
Or something,
Windows, and
yeah,
we tried
something wasn't
forever.
happening on Windows.
We
Yeah,
tried
yeah.
over and over. Something just didn't work, and then the WSL Windows subsystem for Linux wasn't out yet.
Or if it
So
was, it
I
was
think
like version 1 that was pretty crippled by then.
it was kind of like it was still not working completely smoothly. So I spent all this time trying to figure out how to improve my development process, and yeah, I'm never going back to that again. But
Fair enough.
I think I learned one key thing from that as well, which is I got so frustrated at times, not just because of the development like environment, but also there are just parts of trying to debug that application we're working on, because it would take quite a bit of time to run the whole flow, that I started to like come up with all these shortcuts. So I became very sensitive of like, why am I taking 10 minutes to do this thing? And I would ask myself that, like, why am I taking 10 minutes to do this? And then I would ask myself, could I have broken it down into like, there's always all these shortcuts you can use. You
Yeah,
can
yeah.
pull like,
So like the
you can,
development UX became a priority.
yeah, became more of a priority than the actual development itself.
Well, you got to
Yeah.
make yourself comfortable, right?
So it really instilled this idea of like, okay, like I feel like a lot of I've seen developers like they just put up with it because they're like, okay, this is
Yeah.
I'm not going to question why it takes like 30 minutes to boot up this thing I'm supposed to work on.
Yeah.
Um, and they just accept it because this is a job and I'm supposed to work hard.
All too common.
But
It's just people have Stockholm syndrome. It's like, yeah,
Stockholm syndrome.
our build takes half an hour, but that's totally normal. It's always been like that. Oh, really?
Yeah, exactly. I recall one thing I tackled before getting next back into that topic again. It's like starting up the app took um like half a minute sometimes, or something pretty long. It's just like starting it up. And it didn't need to compile or anything. And I think one day I found that like it was because we're loading all these unnecessary dependencies or extensions, and no one looked into it because um well, I guess no one really questioned it, but yeah, I felt a kind of a great sense of accomplishment when I found that out, and ever since then I've been trying to
Yeah.
like any part of my development environment, even down to like, why are you like going through your bookmarks or Chrome history searching for this thing? Why isn't it a bookmark? Or
Yeah.
using those
Yeah.
Chrome search engines, keyboard shortcuts, blah 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 blah.
Makes sense.
Um,
Sort of on a slight tangent, have you heard this recent news about, was it like some sort of the compression library that got hacked. The repository got hacked, and some malicious code was injected through like a vendoring attack, and some guy detected it because his tests for some unrelated things were running like a couple of hundred milliseconds slower, and he decided to get to the bottom of this. Like that was the guy who was optimizing on speed of and responses. Like, why is my login prompt all of a sudden takes extra half a second to show to like for the shell to appear after I put my password in? And apparently there's like a vulnerability that was like stealing passwords that got like leaked into some
The
repository.
hero that no one was it the hero
Right,
this
but
person.
like if you never question these things, you never would have found it. I mean, obviously, it's kind of massive coincidence, but it does say something about the you know burning desire to make sure that everything is. It is for me to a great extent too. It's like the fact that RCI job takes 20 minutes just pisses me the hell off. I just don't have enough time to actually get to the bottom of it necessarily, but it is definitely very high on my list of UX considerations, is like how fast things are.
Yeah, exactly. And everyone gets quizzed on because like if you run a very simple bare bones computer program, and you check how long it took to run, it's like by the
Microseconds,
order of
yeah.
God knows like microseconds or at least in the milliseconds, even if you're doing I don't know
Yeah.
something basic. So why is this thing taking 20 minutes and
Yeah, yeah.
something is horribly wrong?
Yeah, the state of web development is just horrible in that aspect because, I watch, again, going back to John Blow, he built his own language and his own compiler, and then he can recompile an entire game from scratch without using caching in a couple of seconds with like 3D graphics and music and assets. Meanwhile, I have a React Hello World is like chugging for 30 seconds before Webpack does its thing. And it's just like, what? It's just converting text to text. Like, how hard could it be? It's not even compiling it to machine code. Like, what the hell are you doing? So,
Exactly,
yeah, it,
exactly.
it, it pains me dearly.
Um, yeah, I guess back to I'll just briefly touch upon experience of working at a startup. So, uh, mature Series C or Series B or Series C, maybe even further at the time of this conversation. Um, 200 people, very young workforce, mostly in their, early mid late 20s. Um, but semi organized. We still had one-on-ones. We kind of had code reviews, but I think near the latter, once I earned the trust of my peers, and my manager near the like latter half of my employment there, I just merged my own code because they didn't they didn't have like um some sort of access, like they didn't have those permissions set up where the author couldn't merge his own code. But
We couldn't figure out
yeah,
the checkbox in the GitLab UI, so go ahead and merge it. Who cares?
yeah,
Which, I mean,
yeah.
it like, I guess it's like, what is the cost of something bad getting merged? If it's not that, if you can quickly roll back, okay, there was a minor disruption, but like, is it really? So for us right now, in order to merge anything, it's a massive ordeal because like all these pipelines need to pass and complete, and if there's anything, you have to like do it all again, and it slows down the development cycle by so much. It's not even funny. So there has to be some healthy compromise between, you know, I mean, we're not even running push to deploy. So even something gets merged that is technically bad. It's like, well, how bad could it really be, right? But that's a entirely different conversation.
Yeah, that's a good point. Um, yeah, but the very main okay, the very key point about why I enjoyed this transition is that I was working. It's a primarily like a business to consumer business, so um, like everything I was working on was directly used by real people. I'm not saying false people or fake people were
Fake
using,
people.
because before Copperleaf was completely you know we were selling enterprise software to utility companies, right? Energy
Yeah.
companies.
So it's like five
S-
people are using your project, but technically the projects that they're working on using our software could, in theory, affect like millions of people. But there's none of that sense of that immediacy. There's like actually million people pushing the button that I just put there, right? In a sense,
there
if I
were just very briefly there were I think there were at least two other that I just thought of just now, two other points where further demotivated or demoralized me, me me at Copperleaf. One was that I found out even if we improved front end performance,
Oh
it
yeah.
turns out that the employees that were using our software were using our software through something called Citrix. And so I think it was like no matter how fast you made the web app, it's like
Citrix
it doesn't
turned it to
matter
shit.
because
Yeah.
yeah, it takes like 2 minutes for them to load. I heard they would usually like turn on like try to go to our web app and
And put the
then
kettle on. Make a
they would go
sandwich.
make coffee because it would take 2 minutes. So it was at that point I'm like, and there was one other one which was like I was trying to rush for this sort of like soft deadline for this feature, and I wasn't really making it, and I was a bit stressed. And then later I found out like later the conversation was something like, whatever, we'll just punt that feature for half a year. And I also found out a lot of customers actually didn't want to upgrade their software. Because why would they? Because they're a huge like utility company. They don't want like cutting edge software in
They
case
move
it has
slow.
bugs or
Yeah.
exactly. And so the whole what do you call it? The whole environment or set of incentives
Hmm.
is just not like you know
Yeah.
cutting edge software development. No moving fast and like
So like
something they
you
haven't.
went pretty much from one extreme to the other, where you immediately release for hundreds of thousands of people.
Oh yeah. Oh, exactly. Yeah. I guess what the other exciting thing was something I found out the first day was I did a select count star or whatever query from users table. And we were using like something called Snowflake. I'm like, whoa, what is Snowflake? Data warehouse. And it's like we were using all these industry relevant tools. It's like um,
The
I, I,
shiny new things at the time.
shiny new things. We're using a bunch of shiny new like um, software essentially. And I think it was like orders in the order of like tens of millions, right? Probably much more now. Although the way we would create a so-called user, I'm not going to get into that in case, but the way we would create users is a lot easier than
If you
like
visited our
signing up.
site, you're a user.
Yes, exactly. But it was a. I'm like, okay, wow. There's like so much, data and so much
Impact. There's
information,
a lot
and
of impact.
there's a lot of there was a Slack channel where every time someone booked with our website, there would be like it would show like actually how much money that brought in the company,
Oh,
like
that's kind of
pure
cool.
profit, and that channel was just muted because it would like go nonstop.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
like
it's
a
interesting. It's very satisfying. Like for my girlfriend's business, they recently switched to Shopify, and now I hear that cha-ching noise from her phone like all the time. And it's like I don't mind hearing that noise. That noise means everything's going great.
exactly. Um, yeah, it's kind of like the Pavlov's bells that kind of
Yeah, yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Um, but um, but yeah, I enjoyed my time there. We were working. Tech stack was kind of similar, a bit of Node JS, a bit of Python. I think the work itself, like I just got put into the deep end, but I wasn't doing anything like crazy. I was just mostly they just needed a lot of like features, kind of being or modifications being built. I got placed on something called the growth team, and I still don't really understand what growth meant. But I think there's like basically there's like a growth marketing there's like a marketing team, and they kept wanting like these new features to be kind of brought about. We had a very naive experimentation. Not naive, it's actually a decent one. We had something called an experimentation framework, and that was my first time being exposed to something like that. Essentially, like a much beefier version of like A/B testing, which I later found out kind of like is used by a lot of like big tech companies, including the one I'm at now. So it kind of exposed me just a lot to these more forefront tech kind of I don't know if you call them practices or methodologies. So that was quite nice. But
The cutting edge.
yeah, to sum it up, I would say eventually the downsides were that I at some point I actually fell in love with what I was doing because my manager was, he had this like different sense of instilling ownership. He would just be completely hands off. Um, and so like he would just let me make all the call the shots, and he would every every one-on-one he would like try to pile me on like to not more work, but like more this like, oh, you can own this project now. And that was actually quite nice because like
Yeah.
he was just there to support. He wasn't as hands-on. He wasn't anywhere near as micromanagey. He wouldn't review my code.
So
He
he
would
was
just
like
press like,
believe in yourself type of guy. You can do this. You can do this, and then some.
he's like he would just keep like dangling the carrot in front of you. And actually I found that quite effective because he would believe in, I found that with like good managers, they would believe in a greater future version of you um than maybe like you would give yourself credit for.
Hmm.
And so like I remember just a general theme is like every time I would go into one-on-one in general with any manager, I was a little nervous because it's like, ah shit, that thing I promised or that thing I said I would make progress on, I actually didn't make as much progress on as I did. But then, in maybe that's just like an artifact of like Asian parenting. It's like it's always about criticism. Whereas like a good manager always kind of be like, okay, well, they wouldn't even ask for like a status update. Just kind of talk about what you're doing well, and then what plans are up ahead, and then how you can grow more. So it's more like a growth kind of thing instead of like a fixed kind of mindset.
So instead of
Um,
focusing on the negatives, they focus more on the positives, basically.
yeah, yeah,
Mm.
yeah, exactly. But no, this manager was actually very, very super hands off. I'm just gonna say it because he was actually trying to get his own game startup off the ground. So he's actually kind of running. He was like a part time manager. He was like mostly trying to. He was also managing employees of his own startup at the same time. So it's kind of funny, and everyone at the company knew it. They're
Mm.
fine with it. Um,
That's the
so
second
he
time.
had to be very hands on.
Second time we bring up overemployment. And in fact, I have a friend here in Vancouver who I believe still currently works 3 different jobs because
That's nice.
he has 3 kids and a couple of mortgages that he has to cover. So, but
Well,
he's having fun.
that's
So maybe I should get him on and talk about it.
I was looking at the overemployed subreddit the other day, and someone made a comment which I don't think was designed to be funny, but he said he has 2 jobs, 2 remote tech jobs, and he said he actually has inverse Parkinson's law, and I found that kind of funny. It's like, as usually Parkinson's law is like, if you're given enough, I think that's the casual definition. If you're given
Oh,
like
like
10 hours to do something,
you'll
you'll
take
kind of
10
like take
hours.
up all
Yeah.
and probably procrastinate until very end.
Yeah.
But he actually became more efficient and I don't know if you call it disciplined since
Because he has less
when he
time
has
to
two.
he needs to learn to complete stuff in less time, and he got there.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Whereas with remote and all this like freedom of no more 9 to 5 kind of
Yeah,
schedule,
and just
which I
dicking
don't
around
have
at home
either right now.
with all the cool
Um,
things.
yeah, I take quite a bit of time to do something, but
Yeah.
yeah, I learned a bit, and um, I learned quite a bit. I eventually just it was still a remote job, so I was like working out of coffee shops, nonetheless, still the same, or at home. But I like coffee shops a lot more. So eventually, this Meta recruiter reached out, and honestly, to be very honest, I think they had a hiring boom. I think a lot of companies had a hiring boom in 2020. I want to say 2022, 2021. Um, and I think maybe the interview bar might have been lowered a little bit, but or I got lucky in some way, shape, or form. Went through the interview process. And the nice thing was like on the HR portal, and Meta has its own like kind of HR portal, like for applicants or candidates. I saw like I was originally interviewed for a remote Canadian Canada position. I know there's an office in Vancouver, but it's mostly like a H1B U.S. employee holding tank. It's not like an engineering office.
The purgatory.
But yeah, I originally applied for a remote Canadian position, and then I kind of I saw like a box to check like, oh, check here if you want to, if you're interested in the U.S. as well, and I kind of checked that as well. Um, Eventually passed the interview I think out of luck mostly, um, and the recruiter asked me, do you want to stay in the stay in Canada or come to the States? And I was like, I couldn't believe my ears actually for a quick second, because I knew for a fact that the U.S. paid more, for exactly the same position, even though The pay in Canada wasn't any slouch, but I wanted to move. Yeah, for personal reasons, just wanting to kind of leave the place where I kind of grew up, just kind of move somewhere else. So yeah, I happily chose to, move to New York, actually, as far away kind of as from Vancouver as possible.
Right, right.
Well,
It's like enough of Vancouver for one guy. Yeah. Well, I mean, sadly, you're not really missing much. Ever since COVID, Vancouver, it feels like got quite shittier, and I honestly don't even go downtown that much anymore because I honestly don't enjoy being there as I used to like 10 years ago. So that's more of a sad commentary on the state of Vancouver in general. But how's the Big Apple? I mean, I never been myself. It would be nice to go one day.
I think the first impression that I got, I visited before, so it wasn't my first time. I visited once, but I think I got I think on a vacation, sort of have rose tinted glasses. You're usually living in a very convenient place. New York has this like at least I think in Manhattan they put all the restaurants put out their garbage bags on the street for the garbage truck to collect, and it's very unsightly. Like you always see garbage bags and rats. It's a very so my first impression is it's very chaotic. There's a lot more people compared to Vancouver. I guess if you're coming from Toronto, it's not as much of a shock, but in general, Canada is much cleaner. New York, like much of the East Coast, perhaps. Although I don't see Boston being dirty, but New York is very dirty. If you're first time coming here, the 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 infrastructure just feels extremely old. Most of the buildings are like a lot of buildings are pre-war, and we're not talking about like Iraq War. We're talking about World War
World War
Two.
Two, yeah.
Yeah. Everything's like all these like cracks and like all these like random holes in the sidewalk, smell of piss in the subway stations. The most of the subway cars are because in Asia actually the infrastructure is much newer. So I just it's it's sort of similar to what you see in the movies and in the TV shows. A lot of them are based in New York. So it's kind of familiar in some sense, but it's also like okay, you're seeing all the ugly side for the first time, and you're New York is a very urban place, so you're kind of seeing all people from all walks of life. There's no like I know obviously in out in the suburbs it's kind of segregated by race or kind of social economic class, but in an area like Manhattan where I was living, and still am living, the subcultures have nowhere to hide. The all the different races are just coming together. You always you spend enough time walking around, you see the weirdest shit going on. Like I can't even begin to describe it. People cosplaying.
So you're not even
Um,
surprised by anything anymore, basically, is what you're
yeah, yeah.
saying.
Like the whole like screaming homeless people. That's just the norm, right? That's nothing surprising. In fact, the nice thing about New York being very population dense is that the weird people sort of blend are sort of the minority. Like if there's just five people and you're walking around downtown Seattle, there's just five people and two of them are crazy, you're kind of in trouble. But in New York or San Francisco or Vancouver or whatever, but in New York there's like 1,000 people. There's only like three weird people, but there's also like that could attack you. But there's also 10 or 20 other people who kind of like they just happen to be kind of like either not mentally there or they're just like in doing something that you can't comprehend. Um, and so the first time kind of coming here and walking around, you're you're you get tired really quickly because your alert, your danger like alerting system in in your brain just like
Goes
fires
nuts.
like
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah.
It's like okay, danger, danger, danger. Everyone's jaywalking, cars are constantly honking. It's very chaotic.
Hmm.
But eventually get used to it. And I would say like New York in general is, it's very expensive, but there's just a lot of everything. Whatever your interests are, it probably exists. It's very walkable. Um, and I kind of at this point I've been there for 2 years, so it's kind of blended into the background. As I've pretty much kind of got used to it. So I'm back to this like familiar lifestyle of like just mostly either being at home or going to the office once or twice a week, and um, not much else going on, to be honest.
Right. Right. So how's your life at Meta? Like, I guess personally, you're probably like the only person I know who works there. So like I don't have any firsthand accounts of what it's like to be working at a company like that. So maybe
Yeah,
in
so
a few words, I know it's gonna take like another hour and a half to describe likely what's going
yeah,
on
I'll
there.
keep it short. I'll keep it short. So first of all, Meta is not. I haven't worked at any. I actually haven't worked at any of the other fangs or big tech companies. Um, so, and I know, speaking with like people here who, like colleagues who were at Amazon before, that Meta is actually also quite different in its own regard. And there's a few things I'm just gonna say them very quickly. So, before I define them, one is boot camp. Second one is bottoms up culture. Um, Third is like a lot of reorging, but I don't think that's new. Fourth is like workplace. So I'm just gonna talk about what each of those mean. Boot camp is just like kind of nice. It's like an alternative to team matching. So you're not at most companies. You're kind of like you go through an interview. You might get interviewed by a hiring manager, and then you get placed on an appropriate team. But here you're kind of like in this most generalists. I'm not talking about like experts in machine learning or something, but most generalists for software engineering, even for like Android, iOS, backend systems, like front end, whatever you want to do, you're kind of in this sort of like onboarding. It's like kind of like group onboarding basically, but you're basically in this thing called boot camp. It sucks after remote, during and after remote, that you're mostly at home watching videos. There's like a whole curriculum, um, internal like curriculum on like about working here and stuff like that, common knowledge, tutorials, videos, quizzes. By week four, you or week five, you start to get to choose teams, and that's when you kind of go into this internal job board, and a bunch of like, there's a whole flood of managers from different teams trying to sell you their team, and you get to basically sit on different teams for like 2 3 days, pick up a few like tasks called bootcamp tasks, literally, and then basically decide if you mesh with the team, vibe with the team or not, and get to ask a bunch of questions. So that was a very nice thing, and actually I heard that apparently if you're an iOS engineer before, you can actually choose to be an Android engineer, although you might suffer performance wise from not being able to learn Android or iOS fast enough. But you can actually like make a complete career change or shift
So
in
like
your
the lateral
kind of,
movement, is it
yeah,
encouraged or is it tolerated or like what's the degree?
allowed.
Hmm.
I don't know about encouraged. Do so at your own expense. Um, but the one thing I found, what was the second thing I completely, I kind of forgot already.
Bottom up
Bottoms up
culture?
culture.
Yeah.
Before I talk about that, very quickly, is like at a big company, and I think at this point in time, there's like 70, 80,000 plus full-time employees. I don't know how many are engineers, probably 20. I don't want to guess a number. It's probably in the 10, 20, 30,000 range. Um, there's just so many teams, and I'm used to companies where you have one team and that owns the whole product, or at least like the back end of that product. And I know in slightly bigger companies you had that whole like how microservices kind of like what is it called, you organize teams around those services. So someone's on the payments team, someone's on the, I don't know, shopping team, whatever.
Right.
um, but here it's kind of like on steroids. It's like you have one product, let's just say Instagram, and then there's like Instagram Reels, and then there's like four different teams within that. Even more than that, because there's like the machine learning kind of recommendation ranking side. There's like the ads side, which might be another team altogether. There's all these teams called like something experiences, and I never knew what the heck experiences meant. It's like the most generic, vague sort of like name you could plaster onto a team. And I remember just not knowing what any of these teams actually kind of worked on. Like they would describe what they worked on, they would show me their roadmap, but or team charter. Um, so that was one thing that was like really confusing. I'm like I just don't understand what you're working on. in the beginning. Bottoms up culture is like, okay, very easy to kind of state what this is. I'm very used to working in companies where the manager told me what to do. Every week you open up Jira, or every day, I guess. You open up Jira or something similar. You pick up a few tickets. You sprint. Um, your tasks are kind of dictated to you in some sense. You have some leeway as you get more senior, especially on what you want to work on. But it's kind of like top down. But Meta is very bottoms up in the sense that your manager is only there to support you. Your manager doesn't really tell you what to do, although he can sort of like guide you towards what you want to do. And there's usually like projects that are kind of in the pipeline. But the traditional bottoms up kind of definition is like you're supposed to kind of try to own your problem space and try to discover and create and spawn projects out of those problems. So you're supposed to talk to like anyone in the company actually, but partnering teams, whatnot, talk to data scientists to kind of like figure out what it is that is an opportunity, and you create your project out of that. And so this leads to people like kind of scrambling, um, mostly to look for projects that would move metrics because it's all about data being data driven these days. So that you can write it on your as impact on your performance review. But so it leads to this like kind of culture where the engineer calls the shots. The engineer is sort of like the first class citizen in some sense. And it's debatable whether that's good or not. But that was like something I was kind of less used to. But to be honest, my experience here hasn't been too bottoms up. Like I joined this new team, and basically my teammates will tell me like these are sort of projects we think would be good. You can pick from one of them if you want, but um, yeah, that's been my experience
Have you
here.
have you proposed any projects of your own yet?
I have actually been placed into. I have not, because the teams I've joined so far, luckily, have been like there's a lot of scope. The word scope gets thrown around a lot because um, every team has its own like scope of what problem they're supposed to work on, and apparently like different teams will try to take scope from each other. It becomes a massive like political fight kind of thing. Um, but I luckily I have worked only in like pretty structured teams. I've been reorged twice, but I've only mostly been under the same um bigger team so far, which is like the performance side of Instagram.
Hmm.
Quick note is like the some of the things that people work on are really specialized. I remember meeting someone on my team who only focused on something like iOS disk writes or disk usage for Instagram, and that was his whole job.
Wow. Okay.
Um,
That's very
so it's,
specific.
so so it's like the team I'm kind of working in right now, in like a very small company, it would just be like something that a developer would casual sometimes pay attention to, because like if your app is running slowly, then you can just print some benchmark numbers like how long is this function taking to run, or like look at the icicle charts or whatever in Chrome or something. But here we have a whole pillar, or whatever you call it, the whole organization just dedicated to the performance of Instagram, because it turns out that billions of users, if you have shitty performance, um,
You're
then
stealing
it
hundreds of hours of everyone's time, effectively,
and
collectively.
it costs a lot of money. Yeah,
Yeah.
it costs a lot of like ad engagement sessions or whatever they call it.
Hmm.
So that's an interesting thing. At huge scale, you get all these you know
Yeah.
teams and specializations that you just don't see at smaller companies.
That is really cool. That is really interesting. So I guess in our conversation today, you kind of mentioned that like you had a couple of inflection points in your career. Do you foresee that there is an inflection point in your future where you're like, oh man, I really have a lot of these projects that I want to throw in the mix because I think they're really gonna make a difference?
Are you talking about like side projects
No, no,
or?
no. Like within, I guess, Meta's vision of just owning pieces and driving change because you feel like it's a pertinent thing to do. Or like right now, I get a sense that you're pretty happy not having to do that and just sort of fix the things that are thrown your way, but in a more of a switch to like actually finding problems for yourself to fix in a sense, if I interpret the culture correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know actually because I'm happy where I'm at. Um, Fingers crossed unless there's more layoffs. So basically, like I'm happy where I am. I'm currently working on like a multi-year long project, which has kind of like been shaped up, shaped from the get-go, and so I don't really have to go do all this venturing that I just mentioned. I've seen some very impressive like rockstar engineers at the company, or at least seen like them post AMAs because we use this thing called Workplace,
It's like internal
which I
Facebook.
mentioned as like my third or fourth point. It's basically just an enterprise version of Facebook, and it's kind of weird in the sense that like you have to join all these groups of other teams or these bigger groups. It's all groups, and then you basically have a news feed, and that's how you know whether that's how you catch on to updates that other people are like they're announcing some project, some new feature. Whereas at some traditional company, it would be all done through either Slack or emails, right? So I've seen some people like do some really impressive stuff. People that worked on React worked here. Um, so the sky's the limit in some sense, but at the same time, I'm kind of happy, and I wouldn't say coasting or doing the bare minimum. Uh, that would be dangerous for me to say on air anyway. But I guess I would say I would probably rather find my passion or whatever it is. Doesn't have to be tech elsewhere.
Right.
Um,
I see. No, that makes perfect sense.
yeah,
Yeah, that is
yeah.
very cool. I guess one maybe last question before we break is, I guess in that organization, like how approachable are people? Like how easy would it be for you, like you say, oh, there's some rock stars. What are the chances of you like requesting mentorship from them and getting it? Or like is that culture present internally?
There's an internal mentorship program. You can also pretty much talk to anyone, but whether or not they will reply you is another matter.
Right.
There's due to this whole bottom up culture and also this like a lot of people are kind of stressed about performance reviews because it happens every half a year and you have to show impact, and so people eventually get molded by the company culture into it's debatable. Some people are really like ruthless at prioritizing.
Hmm.
So someone makes DMs you and requests you for help or something.
It's just
Some
no.
people might just not reply.
Right.
But some people, even at the higher, at the higher levels, are very generous with their time. I haven't approached that many, but I happen to work with some pretty bright. I actually happen to work with a someone who used to be a professor actually. So
Mm.
he has obviously like a fountain of knowledge. I think he has like a H index of above 100. So like he knows he obviously knows a lot, and but I think that's still an option. I think it's kind of like the same at different companies as well. You could try to reach out cold to someone that's like much higher up and see if you get a response.
Yeah.
But the company honestly has uh there's a lot of pros, I would say, more than cons. Overall, I would say that with such numbers of employees, um there's just it's kind of eye opening. Obviously, you have our own internal versioning, our own internal tooling of everything out there in the industry. Everything from like our own modded version of VS Code, our own set of databases, our own Slack, whatever it is you can think of, meeting tools, yeah, everything. So it's like it's pretty eye opening. And I think some people stay. Like actually, the interesting thing is that the average churn rate is tenure is like something like 2 years. Like a lot of people actually burn out and leave.
Mm.
But experiences vary a lot team to team, obviously. So um, yeah, I would say been good so far. And I enjoy it here. But again, fingers crossed.
Fair
You
enough.
never know.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. That was a really interesting conversation. I think there's like a lot of good bits in there that other people might find interesting. So I hope, for all of us that are watching, I hope you did find it interesting. And Gary, I wish you all the best in your future endeavors at Meta or wherever it may be. And, go enjoy your New York evening. And hopefully, here's to not meeting way too many weirdos out there in the street. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
It was my pleasure.